Hey guys, Eddie back with Couch Talk. Welcome back to the show. If it's your first time here, welcome to the show. Guys, before we begin, please hit like, please hit subscribe below. It's the only way I'm going to break into this industry, and I guarantee you today it's going to be worth the ride. All right, we're going to get in some real trouble today. Today we're going to talk about sex, we're going to talk about gender, we're going to talk about gender identity, gender ideology, and its place in our society today. Now, I want to make a preface to this. Before we begin, this is a very controversial topic, and I want to be clear that many of the things that I say when I go through my research may offend somebody. It will not be my intent to do so. But if it happens, I believe that it is more important to open up the dialogue than to shut it down for fear of offending somebody. I think that's a step that we have to take courageously. Even though I don't wish to offend somebody, I think that the conversation is more important. So, let's begin by talking about the biological side of things, because that's easier for me to define. Basically, I understand sex to be the biological side of this discussion. So male, female, and very rarely, but occasionally, intersex. I think it's 0.2% of the population is born expressing both characteristics of a male and a female, or reduced versions of each. But far and away, that's kind of an outlier statistically. The vast majority is either male or female. So it is, insofar as it goes, kind of a binary structure for the biological side of things. If I were to go, type in, like, what is the definition of a woman in Google, I would get of or denoting the sex that can bear offspring or produce eggs. I mean, that's pretty clear, right? I get a similar answer if I go to the male side. It's the male is the side who fertilizes those eggs. If I go to definition instead of a woman, which I thought might be an expression of gender, but I don't believe it is, the definition I get is an adult female human being, right? Now, I should note that if you go down far enough, I think you go down way to the bottom, you get a definition like a person with the qualities traditionally associated with women. So there is kind of I think gender being a non-binary structure is just now starting to permeate the definitions in society. I don't necessarily know why it is co-opting that word to do so, right? So one of the things we talked about in one of the videos I did before, when we did the video on the true definition of racism, is that, we discussed how the definition has expanded, right? Somebody's co-opted the definition, taken it, and then kind of blown it up and added a bunch of extra things in with it. Another one was the one that we did on marriage, where, again, marriage was, originally X, and then it kind of expanded to encompass a bunch of other things. Now, gender is the latest in a long line of these words that have been commandeered and then expanded. And insofar as it goes, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, because languages evolve all the time, especially the English language, which has any number of exceptions and additional rules that it likes to throw at things. So gender now, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm misunderstanding, but as I understand it, gender is kind of more of a continuum now. It's more of a spectrum of expression and identity. So, and it's really a complex one, because there's a lot of overlays. There's several different axes of expression of gender, right? For example, one of them would be like your identity, how you feel inside, One of them would be, like for example, mate selection. What type of mate you prefer. One of them would be, gender roles and how you express those, or the number of those that you have. And of course, for any number of these, you could have kind of in between answers, right? They're all spectrums. They're all giant axes upon which one could have different examples. So you can see that very quickly with like this. I think it's essentially like a 4 or 5 dimensional word. You can very quickly get basically infinite genders. I think that is probably a mistake, to take a word that used to mean something so finite and expand it to an infinite number of subjective meanings. But it's essentially done now. So this is what we've got. Now, as I was looking through the history around this, I noticed 2 things. Number one, both Google and Wikipedia are 100% dominated by a liberal bias. And what I mean by that is, as I was doing my research, the number of studies that, for example, were, I guess one would call them pro-trans, wasn't necessarily greater than the number of studies that were what one might characterize as anti-trans. But the ones that were pro-trans certainly found their ways to the top. And Wikipedia had much more information on information that would lead to a pro-trans kind of thought. So that was one thing I noticed. I also noticed that I ran into a bunch of paradoxes that were kind of academically intriguing, and yet I could understand how it would be very distressing to somebody in the LGBTQ shoes, because like one paradox, for example, for a trans person is that, gender dysphoria currently, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, but gender dysphoria currently is considered a medical diagnosis, a psychological diagnosis. Used to be gender identity disorder, but they've changed the name a couple of times, and it kind of expanded that line of things too. But as a medical diagnosis, the inherent flaw is that it automatically affirms a binary normative system. Because to say that, that to be gender dysphoric is not the norm, that it's a psychological issue, a medical problem, is a introduces a pathology to that, and by virtue of doing that gives the binary system a kind of a normalcy that it wouldn't normally have. But in doing so, it also gives trans people greater access to gender affirming care, because they wouldn't necessarily be able to access gender transformation surgeries if it wasn't considered a medical problem. If it was considered, for example, just a cosmetic choice, then medical insurance companies wouldn't probably support that financial value there. So it's a very complicated situation, and what I would ask for the audience to do is just to be as sensitive and respectful as possible to every human being on earth, right? Regardless of the circumstances. Now, there are some medical truths that I think do merit mentioning. The truth that there is a difference between a male and a female biologically, and the truth that largely those biologies are driven by chromosomes and numbers of biological differences that I don't think can be overcome by our medical techniques today. So if you truly wish to transition from, say, a male to a female, it is not currently medically possible. Now, I know that's not maybe what people who are seeking that transition want to hear. Now, I want to say that I don't think that that means that you can't do the transition. I mean, if you want to do the transition, do the transition. That's what you want, right? I mean, I encourage people to do what they want in life medically, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else, right? And moreover, I think the government should stay out of our business and let us do what we want in that regard. I'm very libertarian on that matter. But that having been said, to perform sex reassignment surgery does not actually reassign your sex. All it does is make you more expressive on the gender side of things. Now, I should note that gender dysphoria is I can only imagine how distressing it would be to kind of experience that like out of body experience, right? It's almost like, you're trapped inside somebody else's body. And again, like, I want everybody to just be as sensitive to that as you can be, because that's gotta be a difficult situation to be in. I don't know, because I couldn't possibly understand how distressing that is, but I could only imagine, right? Now, that having been said, though, there's no true fix. And I think that's one of the problems we've run into. As I've gone through these studies, study after study after study, shows that, there may be some virtue to gender reassignment surgeries, insofar as they reaffirm to oneself the psychology that they are hoping to accomplish. But I think that ultimately the goal is to actually change one's sex from one thing to another. And insofar as that goes, I don't think that's medically possible. It's just not something that you can accomplish. Likewise, I want to discuss pronouns, because they seem to come into play a lot when we discuss gender ideologies. And one of the things that I note first about pronouns that intrigued me about this discussion is, of course, if anybody ever asked me, to address them in a certain fashion, obviously I would, right? Because it's just a respectful thing to do. Now, would I be telling the truth by calling someone who is biologically born a male a female? Would I be telling them the truth? I don't know. I mean, probably medically, no. The answer is no. But would I be, telling them that their gender is what they think their gender is? Yeah, probably. I mean, so that, there is a sense of it that would be honest. One of the things that I note, though, is that, a lot of these pronouns, like, for example, he, him, she, her, they, them, it's almost always third person, right? So, like, I very rarely find myself in a situation where I would refer to somebody else present in the third person, right? It's like it's almost rude to even assume that would ever happen, right? Like, if I'm sitting there, like, and somebody's right next to me and they're like, hey guys, how's it going? But I'm like just ignoring them, and I'm like, and that guy over there, like, it's like all of a sudden you're already in that frame of mind where you're like doing this really weird, rude thing, right? But that having been said, I can see some situations where you'd be talking to somebody and they would be present or close enough to overhear, and so they might want to have that reaffirmation from the surrounding society. Now, that's a really complex situation, as, number one, again, like female and woman, those pronouns are essentially biological descriptions again, right? So when I say, that guy took the car to the store, or he took the car to the store, I'm referring to a biological male. And I'm doing so based on the biological characteristics that he exhibits. Now, could he, in fact, be a female with a male exterior because he's undergone sex reassignment surgery? Yes, it's possible. But I think for the most part, some of the surgeries are good, but I don't think they're so good yet that I haven't been able to tell up close, what the person's biological nature was. And maybe that's part of the problem, right? Like maybe one of the troubles with this thing is that our medical techniques just aren't sufficient yet to cover what we're hoping to accomplish with them. I don't know. Let me know what you think about that. Comment below, guys. Now, but just, as far as pronouns go, if somebody asks me to address them in a certain way, I'm almost certainly going to do that. Or I'm going to just avoid pronouns in general, which I usually do avoid pronouns in general in my language. And I think that's probably maybe just a safe habit for most people to adopt. I don't see why people can't do that, but again, if push comes to shove and someone asks me, am I a male? And they're not, I'm going to have to tell them they're not. I don't foresee a situation like that ever coming up, but, if it ever comes to that, like, direct question, I'm not going to lie to somebody. So there is that. Now, much of the studies that I saw showed that one of the things that characterizes gender dysphoria is a heavy suicide rate. And so again, I want to say that my heart goes out to these people that are experiencing psychological distress, whether it's because of gender dysphoria or not, right? Any psychological distress is a very, very tough thing to overcome. And I just want to tell you, my heart goes out to you, and you're in my prayers every day. You may not want that, depending on your religion, but I mean no disrespect by that either. I just want to let you know that I appreciate you as a fellow human being, and I hope that you are able to recover from psychological distress. And I hope that wouldn't be offensive, but I can foresee that in society today it might be, and it's a wonder to me that so many things can be said in such a positive context, such a positive hope, and yet be perceived so negatively. So along those lines, I want to say that there's a moral imperative at play to try to be respectful, to try to not give offense. And it's important to respect that imperative. But there's also a moral imperative to try not to be offended, right? That turn the other cheek lesson is a lesson that I think, is lost in society today. I think that far too often we take offense to things that aren't meant offensively, that are often mistakes or just confusions. And I think this gender pronoun thing is one of them, often. Yeah. Are there some people that are doing it on purpose to be hard-headed? Sure, I'm sure there are. And those people are jerks, It is what it is. But the vast majority, I think, are people who are just used to, for example, in my case, 40 years of the reference being explicitly biological. And now all of a sudden I have to contend with literally an infinite number of additional definitions. And honestly, those words to me are just still biological words meant to express biological objects, either in the masculine or the feminine, not as an expression, but as the actual sex. And that's not an intent to offend anybody. That's just the history, right? One last thing I wanted to talk about with regard to this is the studies I've seen show that an overwhelming percentage of pre-pubertal kids that seem to be experiencing a gender dysphoric situation, by the time that they grew up, they grew out of it. So I highly recommend that any kind of gender reassignment or sex reassignment surgeries are not ascribed to children. Anybody that's a minor, I think it should be an adult-only option. Just because, how many times have children demonstrated that they just don't know what they want in life? It is what it is, right? Like, if you find me a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old that's got the world figured out, and that'll be a miracle, right? I mean, I'm 41 and I don't have it figured out, so I still don't know what life is and what the true meaning of life is and how I fit into it. So I doubt very seriously that a 13-year-old's got it all figured out. So that's it. That's a lot to unpack. It's a pretty heavy topic. And again, I really want to reiterate that I do not mean anybody any offense. But I do want to open up the conversation, and the conversation does need to be had. And I'm looking forward to your responses. So thanks so much, guys. Appreciate you bearing through this. I know this was a long one, but I'll catch you next time on Couch Talk.